Hey guys, it's Connor.
And I'm Ryan.
I just want to let you guys know about an awesome podcasting tool called Anchor. We've recently switched to it for Theology Thursday, and it distributes all your podcasts for you. It's a great hosting service. It's absolutely free, and it even lets you start sponsorship, making money with ads with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need for a great podcast in one place.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started.
Welcome to Theology Thursday, an ecumenical space for students to discuss matters of faith and theology.
I'm your host, Connor Grubbs.
And I'm your co-host, Ryan Mock.
And I'm your co-host, Johnny Grubbs.
Well, welcome back, everybody. I hope that you're staying safe and healthy during this time and that you're finding some peace and rest in the peace that we're offered by the Lord during a time of a lot of uncertainty. It's interesting to watch it unfold, and nobody really knows how long this is going to be lasting, but certainly for many of us, kind of adapting to a new way of life. And we've talked a little bit how churches have kind of had to adapt, and we talked briefly about the pastor of, I believe it's River Church, or River Life,
Yeah,
or
River Church.
Yeah, okay. So we talked about him a few weeks ago, how he was going to continue having services, even though the CDC has released all these regulations, and now the president is saying, hey, no gatherings, 10 or more, blah, blah, blah. He's still doing it. And we talked about how that's wrong, and it's kind of dumb. And we tried to be nice about it because we knew that early on pastors were kind of having a hard time making decisions about whether or not to do it, and we did a whole episode on whether or not churches should meet right now. Now that we're a little more into it and some stricter regulations are coming out and the authorities are saying more about it, I want to kind of just put an end to this. The man's in jail now. He got arrested a couple days ago. He should be in jail because he held services and several people got coronavirus.
Connor, he is persecuted.
And this is what I want to talk about, because I've seen so many people, and if you're one of these people and you're listening to the podcast, know that I love you. Again, in the beginning we tried to be nice, and I want to be respectful of all pastors, because I know some people, if you listen to this River Church guy talk, he's kind of a nutcase anyway, and I know some people are probably well-meaning in what they're trying to do, but can we just come out and say, and I think that you two would back me up on this, and we say this in love, if you are still meeting for church, you're being stupid.
Connor, I don't think that's fair. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we talked about this briefly even when it was early on in the whole process. I mean, Jesus commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and if you would want somebody potentially infecting you, you shouldn't be potentially infecting other people. So, absolutely, to love your neighbor right now means to stay home. We can continue to interact as a church via technology. We have that blessing, so why not use it?
Okay, and I also want to say this in love. If you are saying that this is persecution, you're being two things that nobody should want to be. You're being arrogant, and you're also being ignorant. This is not persecution. And to say that it is this kind of sort of entitlement and not acknowledging the situation at hand. And again, I say all this in love, but I say it because if people keep doing stuff like this River Church pastor, and I'm sorry that I keep calling I forget his name, but it really makes the church look bad. It makes Christians look stupid.
I will say this is really important to note. I don't know if you guys saw this, but I actually watched an interview with the sheriff who arrested him. He said, listen, I'm the last one to want to diminish a congregation. I'm a man of faith. I go to church. And he talks about the efforts they went to. They pleaded with him for weeks. They went to try to meet with his lawyers, to try to meet with him. He talks in detail in this interview about how he tried to reason with this man, and the very last resort was this warrant for his arrest. And so he claims to be a believer and claims to even attend church. But he was still appalled that this man had the means to stream and do a high-quality stream, and still wanted to bring all these people together to possibly infect each other.
Yeah, and here's the thing. talking about streaming and doing these online services, yeah, it's an adjustment for some, it's a learning curve for some, but here's the bottom line about that. If the government was censoring our live streams and keeping us from being able to post videos and doing stuff like that, then we'd be being persecuted, right? If they were trying to keep us from communicating and sharing the gospel, we are still allowed to share the gospel. The government's not controlling that, and that's what persecution is.
And in an ultimate sense, we are still allowed to meet together when we've beaten this pandemic. It's not like church or the big assembly has been outlawed as much as it's been temporarily, legislatively restricted.
Right, and I mean, there's even some room for, like, okay, that would be kind of sketchy if the church was the only group being told to do this, but the church is not being targeted. Lots of businesses are closing, some of them for good as a result of what's happening. So it's a very serious thing, and we ought to take it very seriously. So,
could I just interject here? And the dude, I'm going to totally name drop this dude because I think this is hilarious. The dude's name is Pastor Rodney Howard Brown. And he said that they spent $100,000 on a hospital grade purification system. And I quote, literally, this is what he said. "The Lord has helped us secure our congregation. We have brought in 13 machines that basically kill every virus in the place. If someone walks through the door, it kills everything on them. If they sneeze, it shoots it down at 100 miles per hour. It'll neutralize it in split seconds. So we have the most sterile building, I don't know, in all of North America." I think that's hilarious. This man, I think I just lost a brain cell there reading that.
He has a point.
So he, just to give an update, he was arrested, but he was freed 40 minutes later after posting $500 bail. So,
right.
He got out.
I mean, that's an extremely low bail. I mean, you could charge him with the endangerment of thousands of people, but they specifically chose to try to seek a lower sentence for this man because they're like, we're not religiously persecuting you. We're just sending you a message that you are endangering people's lives and you need to rethink this. So.
Yeah. Yep. That's for sure. So, some interesting stuff going on. It's just, look, if you're a ministry leader, if you're a church leader, please be smart. It's not a good look. And, there was another church that was a bigger church that, they were still live streaming even, but they had their choir get together, and a couple people in their choir got it. So, like, even with your live streams, if you're pre-recording and you're having a team come in, really try to limit that as much as you possibly can. Again, it's just about being wise. We're not trying to feed into fear or anything like that. We're just talking about being smart and being a good witness and caring about people. It's as simple as that. This is a season. It's not going to last forever, but let's steward it well. Okay.
Yep.
There you go. Last thing I want to say. Stop coming up with end times theories because of the coronavirus, okay? Tribulation has been going on ever since sin entered the world. Christ's kingdom has been being ushered in ever since he rose from the grave. People who try to take Revelation and put a timeline on these things always get something wrong because the Bible even says we do not know the day or the hour. There are many people who have been through things like this before, whether it was World War II or the Black Plague or whatever it was, that, have felt the way that you're feeling now. Right. This is not the first time.
Even within the past 100 years of the Spanish flu, there were people who would have thought the same thing. Oh, this is the end times. But whenever we do that in light of natural disasters or global crises, whenever we do that, we're we're showing that we have kind of a flawed eschatology, and I would direct people back to our eschatology so we kind of look at a theory that's more about the renewal of creation versus this cascading downfall towards, catastrophe.
Yeah. No, it's a lot of silliness, and I think, I mentioned both of these things again in love, but the reason I mention these things, and at this point I'm just kind of being blunt about it, is because there are going to be a lot of people who, you got to understand, for people who struggle with depression and anxiety and these kinds of things, this is not an easy time. It's making that a lot worse for a lot of people. And they might be turning to the church and to Christians to look for hope and for peace and for answers during this time. Let's please not make fools of ourselves. And that's my real point. That's my soapbox. Okay.
Hey, can I add just one little thing to your soapbox?
Yeah.
While we're just kind of critiquing those who would kind of give the faith potentially a bad name, I do believe in renewal. I do believe in a cyclical view of Revelation, that things happen in cycles, that we see bad things happen, we see good things happen, and ultimately the trajectory is toward the new heaven and the new earth. But inversely, there are people who claim to be prophets or part of the prophetic movement who are saying, well, it's going to be over by mid-April. And those same people said, oh, God's going to end it by the end of March in the United States, and then we're going to be a light to the nations. There are people out there in the so-called prophetic movement who are giving people false hope on the other side. So other people are like, we're heading towards entropy, it's almost over. And other people are like, oh, it's, God's going to do something miraculous. And I believe that he will. I believe that he is. And some of the cures that are coming out, I mean, they're looking, it's not a cure that's completed yet, but they're looking at using plasma from previously infected patients to heal those that currently have the virus. I mean, how amazing would that be, that literally the shed blood of another person would be used to heal another person? That would be crazy. But the bottom line is, it's not like you can't say definitively that it's going to be over at a certain time, any more than you can say that we are headed towards the very, very end.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for adding to my soapbox.
You're welcome.
It's like a nice little bar of Dove just added to the corner there. So, let us get into today's topic. I've said it a million times, I don't want us to just talk about coronavirus every week, but we probably are going to talk about it a little bit every week as things continue, but it's not going to be our main topic. We are still in the section on the church, and this week we get to talk about Ryan's favorite thing in the history of mankind, church government.
I don't like church government nearly as much as I like Chick-fil-A, though.
Okay, that's good. Or Jesus, hopefully.
Jesus is up there also, I have to say.
Yeah.
But yeah, church government is important because you get a group of people together, and how do you do it? How do you lead them? And many times you might feel this in ministry, but I feel this especially working with youth. It's like leading people is like herding cats. It gets messy and it's tough. So there better be a good system in place for leading a congregation. So when we talk about church government, that's what we're talking about. What is the structure that churches put in place in order to lead people? And many churches do it different ways. And many different traditions have historically had different structures for their church government. So yeah, that's what we're looking at today.
Yeah, so there's a few ones, and we're going to be talking about mainly Protestant models today because we are Protestant. Most of our listeners are Protestant, so we're not going to get into kind of how Orthodox or Roman Catholic does it, although maybe another time we could. But today I want to focus.
Well, the Catholic structure is very similar to the Episcopal structure
Yeah.
of church government. So
yeah, the difference with Episcopals is they're not quite as strict about it. They're not quite as dogmatic about it, you could say. But, another conversation for another time. We want to talk about kind of the Protestant views on it today, and I'll kind of start us off with the Congregational-led model, which is very popular amongst a lot of Southern Baptist churches, which is kind of my background, where essentially big decisions that are made within the church are actually brought before the congregation, and anybody who is a member of the church has the opportunity to vote, to discuss. So you're including the entire congregation in the leadership of the church. It's very democratic, it's very American, and I think that's why so many Southern Baptists like it. I do want to clarify, because I've met so many people who've had very limited experience with the Southern Baptist Church, and they kind of throw that as a blanket over the whole thing, where maybe they went to a very legalistic, dogmatic church that was Southern Baptist, that only sang hymns, and that wasn't nice to them, and they assume that's what the whole denomination is. And I can say I think this is true for all denominations. Very rarely does one church give you a clear picture of the whole denomination. There's going to be some good and bad apples in all the bunches. So the Southern Baptist Convention is actually an organization that is a separate entity from the church that has all sorts of resources. A missionary organization, church planting, network, all these different things. And they staff their own leaders and all these things. And when you become a Southern Baptist church, you kind of give into this general fund that feeds all these things. But what that does is it just connects these churches, and it resources these churches, and it puts them all in a sort of like-minded area. However, the church still functions autonomously. So the Southern Baptist Convention ultimately isn't making decisions so direct as to the politics of the church. So not all Southern Baptist churches are congregational led. It's just a very common thing in Southern Baptist tradition. Some are elder led, which we'll talk about in a minute. So they're led different ways because each church is an autonomous church. In fact, each church can have its own bylaws. It can have its own doctrine statement within kind of the doctrinal statement of the whole convention, which actually what most people don't realize, there's a lot of wiggle room. The Baptist Faith and Message focuses mostly on the essentials of the faith, and does clarify specifically on a few things, but as far as things like predestination, things like speaking in tongues, there are certain things where there actually is, and people don't realize this until they read it, but there actually is some wiggle room as far as where churches are going to teach. It's just, we want you to agree on these things to be a part of this community. And I think there's pros and cons to it. I don't think congregational-led is a bad thing in and of itself, although, spoiler alert, I do think there are better ways to do it. And I don't think that the Southern Baptist Convention, the idea of this entity that comes alongside churches and connects them and resources them, I don't think that's a bad thing either. I've seen a lot of pros and cons. One of the pros being it's amazing to go to one of these state convention meetings and see all of these like-minded pastors together who have been called to different parts of the state with kind of a different vision for their different areas, but they get to come together over a few like-minded things and just help each other and be a part of a community, and that's a really beautiful thing to see. So
to clarify, the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, is not a sponsor.
No, Johnny knows that I do love me some Southern Baptist Convention. Honestly, the church I'm on staff at now is non-denominational. I've been to churches of different denominations. I'm not by any means a hardcore SBC only, because I don't think that's right. There's not going to be denominations in heaven. That's not the point. I know there are incredible pastors and leaders and Christians in all sorts of different denominations. And that's why we've talked about before the essentials, kind of the Apostles' Creed kind of a thing. the essentials of the faith, of just Orthodox Christianity, because there are a lot of areas that, at least for now, from our perspective, seem like gray areas, and we may differ on. But that doesn't mean that we can't love Jesus and love each other. So, that's my second soapbox of the podcast.
And I want to offer a few clarifying comments concerning the congregation-led model. There is a nuance, and I'm going to throw that word out there because Johnny loves that word so much. There's a nuance between a congregation-led model and congregationalism. Congregationalism is the idea that each local church functions autonomously from any other church, and they answer to no higher authority. So there is not a higher court above its own church, and so non-denominational churches are inherently congregationalist because they're not a part of a congregation, unless they are part of a convention like the Southern Baptist Convention, in which case, depending on how the particular convention works, the church answers to the convention, but that's not always the case. So a congregationalist church is a church that is its own highest authority. It does not answer to a higher court like a presbytery or a synod. So yeah, most non-denominational churches are congregationalists.
You said the synod, and
but
I'm just
a congregationalist church could be elder-led. So there's the nuance there. As a church could be autonomous, acting as its own highest power, yet still be elder-led. So there's the nuance for you.
Yeah, and I think one of the reasons that's important to mention is we're about to talk about kind of the Presbyterian model, and they do have higher offices that I believe, and you can correct me as we talk about it, they do consider those offices and those courts to have a sort of spiritual authority over the churches that are under them, whereas the Southern Baptist Convention is very clear that the churches that are affiliated with it are autonomous, and that the Southern Baptist Convention doesn't hold any spiritual authority. They can decide to withhold or even boot churches out of the convention, but that doesn't make them any more or less a church. These are benefits and things that exist, outside of, kind of in addition to the church.
Yeah, and I like how you mentioned that, because it is true in the Presbyterian model, the higher court does have spiritual authority over the individual congregations, as opposed to what you mentioned with the Southern Baptist Convention. So that is an important distinction there.
And also what you were talking about, I think describes my church, because we are a non-denominational church that's not affiliated with any sort of network or anything, and we're also elder-led. So I guess in that sense you could say we're a Congregationalist church that's elder-led.
Yeah, there you go. So that's a perfect example. Likewise, continuing on the Congregationalist thought, a church that is pastor-led, in which case the pastor makes all the decisions as far as governing decisions go, or administrative decisions go. Many pastor-led churches are Congregationalist churches. Many pastor-led churches don't answer to a higher authority. Many megachurches are like that. Not all megachurches, but a lot of them are. So just another thought on the Congregationalist model.
Yeah, and the pastor-led model is kind of this. At times they might have, maybe an advisory board or something they put in place that's some people that are keeping them accountable. But I do think there's a real danger to giving one person all of the spiritual authority. First of all, it's not biblical. Second of all, it's dangerous. And there are many churches that I have seen and even visited and been to and kind of gotten to see where ultimately what you get more often than not in a situation where it's pastor-led and it's just the one-man show, no other form of accountability or leadership or anything, is you end up getting a church that looks a little more like a cult than a church. It's a very dangerous thing, and it is the one of these models that I am going to poo-poo on because it's not wise. Now, I'm not saying all pastor-led churches are like that, but I'm saying it's very easy for pastor-led churches to become that. And when we hear government and politics and all this thing, well, why is this even involved in the church? And we'll get into this, more as we wrap up, but it's because it is biblical, and it's not about so much government or politics or power. It's about accountability. We as fallen human beings need those checks and balances to be held accountable in how we lead, and we're better together. So with that being said, any other thoughts you guys have on the pastor-led model, and then we can move into Ryan's club, the Presbyterian world.
I'll stay quiet.
Yeah, I have no further thoughts on pastor-led. And when we say that term pastor-led, we're not saying that a pastor shouldn't lead his church. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about when a pastor makes all of the administrative and executive decisions, and there's no other checks and balances beyond what the pastor wants. That's what we're referring to.
Yeah, because in all of these models, the pastor has some sort of spiritual authority. The pastor has some sort of leadership role. That's never not the case. It's just about how much power he has and how much accountability there is.
Yeah, so I think this is a good segue into talking about a Presbyterian model of church government, because one of the keys of the Presbyterian model is this idea of checks and balances. At the very bottom, where the rubber meets the road of doing church, Presbyterian churches are elder-led. And what it means to be elder-led is in each local congregation, you have a group of men who have been designated as ruling elders, and elders being those who make governing decisions for the local body. So we say that the three permanent offices prescribed in Scripture is the pastor, the elder, and the deacon. So we all know what the pastor is, and I just kind of explained the elder. And then the deacon, I'm sure we're going to talk about this more, but the deacon, the role of the deacon is the servant. So many Presbyterian churches and other churches, obviously this is not just a Presbyterian thing, but a church would have a diaconate, which is a group of deacons, and they serve the congregation, whether that's serving the poor and the needy in the church, setting up, tearing down, stuff like that. All the things that need to be taken care of in the church. That's what the deacons would take care of. And so then the elders make governing decisions, and the pastor oversees the spiritual health and well-being of the church. So that's the bottom. That's where the rubber meets the road for church government. The body of elders in a local congregation is called the session. So that's what we call the lowest court in a Presbyterian model. So the session meets, the pastor's included in this. They meet and coordinate and make decisions for the church. This is great because you have multiple people. And so you don't have one person who's making all the decisions and who could claim power. That's why we love an elder-based model, and which is why many churches that even Orange Presbyterian follow that model. So that's the lowest court, is the session. And then we have a middle court, which we call the presbytery. The presbytery is and actually I would like to read the specific definition provided in and this is going to sound really nerdy, but I'm going to read the official definition given in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian Form of Government document. And so if you want to look this up later, you can look on the Associate Reformed Presbyterian website, and they have links to their documents, their forms of government. The form of government, which we call FOG, says that the court of the ARPC, next higher than the session, is the presbytery, which has the oversight of a group of congregations within a specific geographical area as determined by the General Synod. So the presbytery is the next higher court over the session. It is a court that is assembled by the ruling elders of the local congregations in the area. And so the presbytery has oversight over those local congregations. So you have, and so for example, in the Associate Reformed Presbyterian denomination, which is the denomination that I belong to, we have 22 local congregations in our presbytery, and the presbytery makes up all local congregations in Florida. So there's 22 local congregations in the Florida presbytery, and there's 10 presbyteries in the United States. The next higher up court in the ARP denomination is the General Synod. So the Synod is all the presbyteries combined together, and is made up of the ruling elders and pastors
and Emperor Palpatine
local congregations. Yes, exactly. So that is how the ARP, the Associate Reformed Presbyterian denomination, structures that. There's a lot of different Presbyterian denominations, and so every denomination in the Presbyterian tradition is going to have their little nuances. They're going to probably going to change a few words around, and their systems that they put in place may look a little bit different than the ARP, but that's how we do it. And as Connor mentioned before, and as I mentioned before, the higher courts have spiritual oversight over the lower courts. So when a local congregation is having problems, the elders or even the congregants, the lay people, could go up the chain of command, or in some cases skip a chain when necessary, and go to the presbytery and say, hey, look, we have a problem in our congregation. Our pastor is saying crazy things, or our elders are all out of line. And the presbytery will help the congregation get everything back in order. In fact, in certain cases, if a pastor has to step down, the presbytery will supply a substitute pastor to help preach. So that's one of the beautiful things about this model.
Yeah, so basically, if their churches were still meeting during a pandemic, they could go to the presbytery and say, "Hey, we gotta go to Facebook Live. This isn't okay."
Yeah, the presbytery. I have not been in conversation with the Florida Presbytery because I'm just the lowly youth director in my church. But I know Pastor Mike has been in constant communication with the presbytery about how to do Zoom meetings and how to do Facebook Live, stuff like that. So I know that they are really collaborating on that.
I hate to go here, but I bet you River Church is pastor-led. So,
throwing shade.
You never know.
I don't know. I'd have to look it up.
You don't want to assume. So don't quote me on that. But here's the thing. The ARP is also not a sponsor. I I have a few closing thoughts because it's interesting to talk about, okay, kind of the history of the church. What are some of the common models? We really only scratched the surface today. But I think what you start to see is that there's some similarities, amongst them, and every church kind of tweaks it a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think what really matters is okay, what does the Bible have to say? And I'll say this, I don't believe the Bible gives like this prescribed method that every church must follow. It gives a few things that every church should include in their leadership structure, but there's room for different churches to do things a little differently depending on their needs and their context.
Right. I think that's a clarification that I would like to make too, and you're making it, but just the idea that these things contained in Scripture are things that, like Paul, the apostles, it was specific advice given in a certain context. Now, you can't do that with all Scripture and say, oh, well, it was just in that context. There's wisdom to be derived from that context, from that space. But what that does is it allows us to realize that in some ways, these things are non-essential. There's very few ways of doing church government that's sinful, that's not of God, but the closer you follow the wisdom of the apostles in Scripture, I do think the better off you are.
I think it has to be approached just like we were last week, is, okay, what necessary elements based on Scripture need to be there for a church? Well, does living in a commune and selling everything we own, is that part of it? No, that was their context. But there are other things that we see that are prescriptive for the church, that are, this is what a church looks like. This is what God wants his church to look like. So we got to approach this the same way. I'm going to go ahead and just right out the gate say I am all for the elder-led model. I think it's biblical. I think it's effective. Most of the time when the original Greek word was used for elder, it was used in the plural, and Paul addresses the elders often in the letters. So when he's writing to the leadership of a church, he's very rarely referring to one person. He's almost always referring to a group of elders, or overseers is another way that's interpreted, and even gives kind of a guideline for these are the standards that an elder should be held to. Not just anybody can fill this role. I also, people have made a biblical case for the congregational-led model. I think some people have found a way to kind of mix both of them together, and all of that's fine and good and dandy. Deacons, I think, are really important. We see that established in the New Testament as well, when Paul and some of his comrades are realizing that they don't have any time to pray and to teach and to do kind of oversee the spiritual needs of the people they're ministering to, and that there's some of the widows and people who aren't getting fed, and they just realize, we need to get some other people in here doing this part and making sure it's done right, and so they bring in the deacons to meet physical needs. A lot of congregational-led churches have deacons. A lot of elder-led churches also have deacons. Churches should have deacons. It's a good thing to have. But I'm very much in favor of the elder-led model. And here's the main thing. Whether you go congregational-led, whether you go elder-led, whether you do a mixture or some kind of amalgamation of all these different things we're talking about, the important thing is that and we already said this, but this is kind of, I think, the main takeaway that we get from the New Testament, is that the leadership does not all fall on one person. That there's accountability, and that a group of qualified leaders are in place for any given congregation. Yes, leaders with an S. It's never one person. That just doesn't work. We still have a sin nature that we're being sanctified from, and we've already been saved from it, but we are being sanctified from it still. That's an ongoing process, and I think you give any one person too much power, that's going to get to their head, and it rarely ends well. So, any other thoughts just on, okay, this is kind of where my study of Scripture has led me, kind of a conclusion, a summary? Ryan, are you still with us?
Yeah, I thought Johnny was going to say something.
No, he just hummed.
But I would just like to say, like, a lot of the information that I have in front of me. Well, first off, I would quote in the Associated Reformed Presbyterian form of government, but also a key document for many Presbyterian denominations is the Westminster Confession of Faith. In the back, they have a form of government with a proof text, and just looking through this, they kind of base this. The Westminster Divines, who were the authors of the Westminster Confession, they based their form of government much like how you put it. The scriptures do not lay every detail out for church government. Paul said, this is how you need to do it. You need to have this amount of ministers. This is how you ordain a minister. This is how often you should have annual general assemblies. The scriptures do not lay it out like that. We just see a model that is given in the New Testament that worked for them. And that's how we do it. And that's kind of how the Westminster Divines put it in writing their form of government.
Good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, honestly, I'm going to look at it. We may have a little more in this church section. We may be getting close to wrapping up our systematic theology for now and kind of getting more back to a Q&A session. Now that we've built up a little bit of a bigger audience than we had in the first season, we have talked about kind of going back to our original format, which is taking questions from you and answering them to the best of our ability. We're certainly not the experts. That's not the point of this show. This is for students. It's by students. And it's just a safe place for us to discuss these things as we continue to learn and to grow. And we're praying for all of you and hope that you're all staying safe. And we, as always, greatly appreciate you taking the time to join us and to listen. You have any feedback, you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and you can email us at theologythursdaypodcast@gmail.com.